Good morning, everybody. I'm Maarten Stassen from the European Privacy Academy. First of all, I need to apologize my colleague and partner from Deloitte, Eric Loosterborg, who has a serious throat infection and couldn't make it to chair the panel today. So I take that over from him today. I now pass the word to my colleague.
So hopefully this is on. We are here today to talk about how we're going to stay ahead of cybersecurity and try and just stay ahead of the bad guys and figure out how do we make sure that your systems are going to not allow them in with all the issues that everybody has seen in the press for many years that seem to be getting worse and worse, as I'm sure we'll talk about the Sony incident, the latest Sony incident. I'm going to have all of the panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Douwe down at the end. And if everybody could just take a minute and introduce who you are, and then we'll start the program.
Okay, do we use these microphones? Please. Yeah? Okay, can you all hear me? Hi there. I'm Douwe Korff. I'm Emeritus Professor of International Law at London Metropolitan University, which means I've just retired from London Metropolitan University. I'm a human rights lawyer by background. I've done a lot of work on data protection, and I'll try and say a few things about the human rights aspect, the human rights issues that come up in the context of cyberspace, and I think I'm the last speaker today. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Lillie Coney. I have worked in privacy and cybersecurity for about 10 years. I currently work as Legislative Director for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee at the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. My words are my own. I'm not here to make policy statements, but I think you need to know where I'm coming from. Prior to my work on the Hill, I was Associate Director at the Electronic Privacy Information Center. My introduction to cybersecurity and data security was through electronic voting, which is a very interesting, hard problem. But from there, it got into other areas regarding the security of data while at rest and in transit over the internet or over networks. My comments today on the panel will look at looking at the evolutionary stage of where we are in cybersecurity development, what are the lessons from the past that might indicate possible paths forward, how the Sony breach highlighted the nexus between privacy and cybersecurity in ways that privacy experts have been trying to do for some time. Thank you.
So yeah, I'm Maarten Stassen again. I'm the faculty leader of the European Privacy Academy, which is a knowledge and networking center where we try to provide the necessary tools to give to attendees to help them tackle the privacy and security challenge. So we try to provide pragmatic, effective, and efficient manners to do that.
Good morning. I am Laurent Bernat. I work for the OECD Secretariat in Paris. I have the double pleasure of working on security and privacy in the same working party, for the same working party at the OECD, and therefore I am delighted to be here to discuss about security in a conference dealing with privacy. That's relatively rare. So thank you to the organizers. I will speak about the economic and social perspective to these issues, and in particular how organizations can address the issue while maximizing their economic and social interests.
Thank you, all of you. Lillie, would you like to start?
The first area I'd like to talk about is the evolutionary stage of cybersecurity. I strongly believe that with people, we don't really invent new ways of working together as community or developing or organizing ourselves. It's just the same process, but in different venues. Now, cybersecurity, the internet created a whole new environment for people to engage in all kinds of activity, and eventually corporations and companies came along, and now the commercial business, government resources, all the activity that happens online, it seems like it's been with us forever, but it's only been you know, since about roughly 1994, the public phase of the internet occurred. But the challenge for cybersecurity is that it was not, the platform, the medium of the internet was not designed for security so much as it was for resilience. So getting the message through was most important, not tracking who the message was coming from. The people who designed the internet pretty much are a small community of people who were experts in their field, so there were no real concerns about people trying to do bad things to each other and not have consequences for that. Now that we're looking at the internet as juxtaposed over the experience of human society, I'd say we're about in the Middle Ages, where there are castles, there are moats, there are very thick firewalls, there are very skilled people, depending on the resources that a particular institution might have, and thereby a sense of security is created. Unfortunately, there is no perfect security. So if something happens, the protocols for reacting to an incident, one dealing with the public and the media, of course, but the real issue for an entity is survivability. And so the lessons from the past always inform what we do in the present. It's just the way things are. So past experience, they want your data, they want your money. So if they do something that impacts your customers, you have to deal with that. Your money exposure might be data, a breach notification laws may dictate what you need to do. You make sure your customers have the availability to have their credit monitored, and you pretty much pick up the pieces and you continue on. What are the lessons from the past that might indicate possible paths forward? One thing about cybersecurity, it's very interesting. It's just like any other kind of environment. The people that populate the environment, their level of skill and expertise, whether they are users or potential threats, all depends on what resources they may have available to them. Unfortunately, for someone to be a threat in cybersecurity, they need a computer, and they need internet access, and they need knowledge or skills on how to use the resources they have to attack a system. And the system has to have a vulnerability. And the way software was initially, it came into being was on the same production schedule as hardware. So when IBM hired the young group of people who eventually started the company Microsoft, they had to produce the software based on the production schedule for hardware, not on whether the software was ready. So software was provided for the hardware. If there were problems with that software, they would do updates and patches, but that pretty much became the norm. So the vulnerabilities became a normal part of the process of producing software. Software became more and more complex. When you start getting to millions of lines of code, it presents challenges to the security. And those exploits are the things that are used by attackers in order to get into systems and to cause harm. So the one thing that I noted that's very important about what we've seen is that if you have an environment where there's no sense that there's going to be a consequence, and that, let's face it, the internet environment, law enforcement officials, not just in the US, but around the world, have said we're not going after people who are committing fraud online, whether it's a Nigerian scheme or whether it's some other type of exploit to get cash or commit crimes along the lines of identity theft. We don't have the resources. They made it very clear that they don't have the resources to pursue these criminals, so that becomes a safe haven for types of criminal activity that can yield high reward with low threshold of a downside for the criminal. It's just basically a lot of low-hanging fruit to be pursued. And the reality is, if you don't make it harder and harder for criminals to commit criminal acts, then you're not going to narrow the number of people who actually could be successful at committing a crime. If you don't do that, it's the pool of people you have to constantly worry about is huge. I mean, because the nature of the internet is a global medium. Anyone, anywhere, could potentially have the skills and the desire to go after another network or to commit some kind of act that may be a threat to a system or a company's resources, etc. So working on how to narrow the scope of potential threats to networks will have to come at a couple of levels. One, going back and trying to rewrite the software for everything that's out there, forget it. That's not going to happen. We know applications are pretty new, but although they're new in relative to other forms of software, there are lots of problems with how applications were developed. Most application developers are using components that were created by someone else that may have functionality that the application developer has no knowledge of. So we have app components that may, for instance, it may do something obvious that a developer needs for that application to do. The first hop when data leaves a device that is using that app may be visible to the user. I know it went to this server, but from that server, where else is that data going? That may not be transparent, along with the fact that the application may be doing other things you don't want it to do. So having clean libraries of components for app developers to be able to use would be a great benefit to users of the technology. But no one's going to step up to do that because the libraries would almost have to be free in order for them to be available for app developers who may have little in the form of resources. And that the library would have to be, you'd have to have someone, well, NIST has a software reference library, and I happen to like the fact that they thought this up, that you can use the hash function to verify the application or the software that you're using actually is the software that was originally released. So if you are a company that's hosting apps on your service in order for your users to use, there's a way to verify that those apps are in fact clean apps, that nothing has happened to that app from the time it was filed with the software reference library. That's one approach to look at. The other thing that I think is interesting is that the internet is basically a protocol. So we have one basic protocol. I'm sure there are others out there, because if you really want to move stuff around and you want to keep that kind of behind the curtain, or at least be able to move data without it being visible or available, you just come up with a new internet protocol. It would be very helpful, instead of trying to work in this environment which resilience is the number one factor, to create environments or different lanes that are part of the internet protocol suite. It shouldn't just be one internet protocol, it should be a suite of internet protocols, each designed for a particular use. One may be designed for medical information that has to be highly secure because it has to be accurate. One may be designed for financial transactions. One may be designed for data transactions that have to be authenticated, and you need to be sure that the data hasn't been changed. The chain of custody issues are addressed. And then you can have the general internet for people to use. It should be as easy as looking at your email interface, clicking the lane you want to use for a particular communication, just like you can say, I want this to have high priority delivery, or flag it for a particular type of treatment as in the header of each packet, saying what it is and how quickly it needs to move and with what level of security, whether it should be automatically encrypted coming out of your emails off your desktop or your device onto the internet, and it's traveling using this particular protocol, would add a level of security, because you'd need to know each protocol and the vulnerabilities of each protocol in order to become a problem. And the protocol of requiring identification and authorization in order to be on that particular lane or using that particular service can provide a level of security that otherwise doesn't exist right now. And then the last issue that I think is really huge is the numbers of people that you might have available to actually secure systems. The United States have roughly 300 million people. The EU has about 500 million. China has over 1 billion. India has over 1 billion. If you talk about resources you can field in order to, I don't even want to try to avoid using this phrase, so I'm going to think of another way to put it. If you really got into some kind of tiff with someone online, whether it's a nation state or an entity that had the resources to hire its own group of people who would go out and make their adversaries' lives very difficult, some countries are not in a situation where they could adequately defend themselves because they're not going to have the bodies to do it. So automating the process, I call it creating an autoimmune system for the internet, where certain types of behavior of traffic might indicate that there's some problem, because you can't have enough bodies watching physically what's going on. You need to be able to sift through the billions of bits, or trillions of bits, and let's face it, they're gonna come up with a name for a new number at some point, of data that's flowing to determine what's a threat or potential threat, and elevate that to the level of a person being able to review. That's going to be very important. And the other thing that's a problem is password fatigue, and I'm seeing it. I see it in myself. I try to be very diligent about not using the same password over and over again for anything. The user ID is pretty much everyone's email address, which is half the equation for getting into a system. So we have to do something about automating that, coming up with a way of allowing people access to systems that they are authorized to have access to without making them remember passwords. When Bell Labs came up with how long a telephone number was going to be, they picked 10 digits for a reason, because we could remember 10 digits, and we knew several numbers we could carry around in our heads. This is the good old days for young people out there. Now most of us don't know a number, because all of it's all on the cell phone. We click a button and the number is dialed. With passwords, no one's really figured out exactly what we can remember with passwords. Now, my recommendation is that we have alternative, every key and every letter on a keyboard can be used to represent another key and another letter. You'd almost have to have a book of 6 or 7 or 8 of your own personally designed alphanumeric characters, letters that represent something to you, so when you create a password, it's easier to remember. But that's a whole nother thing. I think that we need to do more with automating things, but in the process, we have to come up with transition ways to deal with issues. The last thing is the Sony breach. That breach clearly demonstrated the link between data privacy and confidentiality and cybersecurity. They took the data, they threatened the company, you do what we want, or we release your data. That was enough to get that company, just based on what it did. This company produced movies. I wouldn't have picked a movie company as being the poster child for why privacy and cybersecurity are linked. You cannot delink those two things, because the people in the company all have things. None of it was unlawful. It was just sensitive data that they did not want out there. But it was enough to coerce that company into an action that it later pulled back from because of the broader consequences. But in the end, the cybersecurity has got to be intrinsically tied to the data, because that's what the thieves want, that's what your adversary wants, and it's the one tool that can force companies or entities to do things they otherwise would not want to do. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillie. Lauren, we'll pass it to you now, and then we'll take questions at the end and thoughts.
Thank you. Oops. Okay, that's the wrong one. Okay, now I am in that problem. The wheel. That sounds good. There we are. Good morning again, everyone. Well, for the OECD, digital security is not a new issue. 20 years ago, my organization, the OECD, adopted the first guidelines for security of information systems and networks. And they were revised in 2002, and we are currently revising them again. It is expected that the new recommendation will be adopted in September by the OECD Council, and I will introduce this morning briefly some of the main aspects of this new recommendation, and in particular the aspects that relate to the topic of this morning, which is what can organizations, public and private organizations, do? How should they address this challenge? Well, I've been through that already, so just move. If we look at this issue from the perspective of public and private organizations, the current context has 3 main characteristics. First, we see the increased integration of ICTs in the economy. Consumer products and services increasingly embed ICT components. But beyond that, ICT has become essential at all stages of the value chain, from research to production, logistics, marketing and sales, as well as support functions like finance and human resources. And this is taking place across all sectors, creating a real digital dependency across the economy. A second characteristic is that the benefits that stem from ICTs are boosted by interconnectedness and openness of systems and networks. It's not just ICTs that generates more prosperity. It's open and interconnected ICTs. The third element is the increase of threats. We see threat sources such as organized crime, state intelligence agencies, terrorist groups, and we are far today from the early days when teenagers, script kiddies, were the main prospect of external security threats. The threat can be much more sophisticated and it can take place at a large scale. You've heard of recent very large data breaches, Target store at the end of 2013, JP Morgan, Sony Pictures, which has been just mentioned. You've heard of physical impact from cyber attacks, sophisticated cyber attacks, Stuxnet in Iran, and recently in December, the German Federal Agency for Cybersecurity published an annual report which mentioned that there was a very sophisticated cyber attack in a steel mill in Germany that created massive physical damages. There are no more details. So although, of course, it's not every day, it's it's more rare, physical damages can happen, and it could very well be a trend. Now, thinking in terms of the wheel, thinking in terms of a CEO, of a decision maker in the public sector, or a business line manager responsible for the achievement of economic objectives, what is my problem? How can I tackle this problem? The first approach is to consider that the problem is related to the digital environment. And I would say that that's the historical approach. And that was the approach of the OECD back in 2002 and also in 1992. It's about cyber security, the security of cyberspace, protecting an environment, securing an environment. From that perspective, security measures can be placed in the environment to secure it. And yes, it is true, security measures are indispensable. But this approach faces two main challenges. The first is the scale challenge, and Lillie just mentioned some aspects of the scale challenge. Another aspect is that the perimeter of information systems has become too wide and too complex. Think about trends such as cloud computing or bring your own device, or the Internet of Things, where many objects will embed networked digital component to extend their functions and bring, again, more economic benefits. There is another challenge, which is the economic challenge. Security measures, in general, can act also as economic inhibitors because they create barriers, they prevent things from happening. Therefore, they also reduce interconnectedness and openness in the digital environment, which I've just mentioned as being essential to economic and social prosperity from ICTs. So yes, security measures are indispensable, but the criteria to select them is not found in the environment itself, and it's not just about understanding the threats. One needs a framework to select the appropriate and proportionate security measures that will address the threats while keeping the environment open and interconnected to unleash innovation, enable productivity gains, and increased competitiveness. So the approach promoted by the OECD is the adoption of a risk management framework. Now, these terms, risk and risk management, are used very much in that space, but they are not always very well understood. So let's spend a little time on this. Again, looking at the problem from the perspective of the decision maker, launching a new product or a new service or improving one aspect of the supply chain, all economic activities, all decision that a decision maker will take implies a degree of uncertainty. Nothing is never secure. As Lillie said, nothing is ever free from danger, which is the definition of security. Free from danger, free from harm. Making decision is taking risk in order to achieve some benefits. Risk can never be entirely eliminated. The only way to eliminate it is to do nothing, not carrying out the activity, not getting the benefits. If the environment cannot be secured, the risk has to be managed. Actually, decision makers in organizations, public or private sector, are risk managers. Risk management is the process to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And this is true for any activities, whether they relate to the digital environment or not. Instead of considering the security challenge as inherently related to the environment, the infrastructure, or the technology, and turning to technicians to bring a technical solution to a technical problem, decision makers should manage the digital security risk just like they manage other risks. This means starting from the economic and social objective of the activity, and when assessing the risk in general, which decision makers generally always do, whether in a framework or not, in a very clear methodology or more intuitively, also assessing the digital risk. And when treating the general risk, also treat the digital one at the same time. Treating risk is deciding the acceptable level of risk and how to reduce the risk to that level. Risk can be taken, that is accepted, let's just go for it, and we don't put security measures. We take the risk. We see what happens. It can be reduced by adopting security measures, by changing the activity to expose it to less risk, by innovating in other terms, by being prepared to incidents so as to reduce their propagation, their escalation, and their impact when they happen, because some incidents will happen, because nothing is ever fully secure. This relates to the theme of resilience, which in business is simply business continuity. It's not specific to ICTs. Risk can also be transferred, for example, through insurance, if insurance schemes exist in that space, of course, if there is a market for that. And risk cannot be avoided other than by not carrying out the activity and give up on the economic benefits. And sometimes when the risk is too high, well, and there is not enough security measures, or there is no security measures that you can take that will reduce it to an acceptable level, well, sometimes you may have to give up on using ICTs for achieving a particular objective, or for achieving any objective. In this framework, we see that framework that's on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of that, but in this framework, we see that the selection of security measures results from a choice that takes into account the economic interest, because the acceptable level of risk has been defined by the economic decision maker from an economic perspective in relation to the activity and the benefits at stake. This process ensures that the security measures will not undermine the economic benefits that they aim to protect. Well, while this may sound simple, it is not. And I'm not sure it sounds simple, actually, but if it sounds simple to you, it is not easy to implement. Because it means a systematic cycle, because risk itself is dynamic, the environment is dynamic, the use is dynamic, everything changes all the time. Therefore, you cannot just say, I have managed the risk and I go. No, you have to establish a cycle where everything is continuously assessed and treated, where the risk is continuously assessed and treated. It also requires awareness from the decision makers that this is their problem and not primarily a technical problem. And again, this may sound simple, but it's a cultural element. And perhaps one of the main benefits of the large-scale breaches that we have heard, of the intelligence stories that we have heard since almost 1 year and a half now, and that we continue to hear about, is that they increase the awareness of the highest level in organizations. They increase their awareness that, well, this is a risk, just like any other risk. But there is a long way to go for all organizations, public and private, to think in these terms and not just address it as a technical issue. It also requires a clear distribution of responsibility. Decision makers in charge of the economic activity should own the problem, as I have just said, once they're aware of it, and apply their risk management skills to it just like they do to any other risk. It also requires full cooperation between them and the IT experts who work for them. And again, that may sound easy, but it is very difficult. Technology left alone does not know what the acceptable level of risk is for an activity. It does not know where it is okay to reduce openness, where it is not, and at what level to reduce it without harming business or the economic activity. Decision makers responsible for the economic activity know that. They know where these limits are, but they don't necessarily understand the digital environment and the digital threats. And they don't understand the security measures either, or the vulnerabilities. So these two sides have to cooperate. And that's a big governance challenge in organizations. With the new recommendation that the OECD is working on, the OECD calls for the integration of digital security risk management in decision-making processes in order to ensure that cybersecurity, if we want to use this term, I don't like this term, but if we want, everybody uses it, to ensure that cybersecurity serves economic and social prosperity without restricting it. Just as a final point, if you allow me a couple minutes,
Oh, you got it. Go ahead.
it's just now, okay, it's a conference that deals with privacy. So, of course, there is a very important linkage between what I have said and privacy protection, because privacy protection, in part, relies on security measures. There is, in the 1980 OECD privacy guidelines, a security safeguards principle, which has been implemented across all jurisdictions which have adopted privacy laws. And the framework I've just presented is a very robust framework to implement this privacy principle, the security safeguards. Now, that said, one question is, could we use this risk management approach to better implement not just the security safeguard principles of the privacy frameworks, but the whole privacy frameworks, all privacy principles? And that's an important question, because there we could better protect privacy while, at the same time, fostering economic and social prosperity. We would address this trade-off, which has always been difficult. However, it's not straightforward, again, because those who assess and manage the risk for cybersecurity, the security risk, are those who will face the consequences of a failure. When they address privacy, they would assess and manage the risk faced by others. And that creates a conceptual challenge to implement the risk management framework in that space. Some have been working on this. A couple of papers have been developed by the Center for Information Policy and Leadership, and the OECD is working on this. As of now, we are starting to work on it to see how to use the experience we learned on the security side to better protect privacy while and to reinforce the implementation of the privacy principles. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurent. Maarten, we're going to pass it to you so you can give us some more detail.
Yeah, so I will look at the issue from the perspective of data protection officer. I'm a lawyer myself, and I worked as a lawyer in Belgium and in Spain. But then I also worked as an in-house data protection officer. So I ate my own dog food, so to speak. And I know that, in fact, what a DPO needs is to really understand what the issue is from a practical point of view. So not just the theory, but give me something visible, give me some tools, some guidance that I can use and take back. Because in all companies, we know that even if you want to if you compare it with cars, if you want to install the Rolls-Royce solution, there's mostly only a budget for a much smaller car. So how do you do that, and how? With which tools can we give, and which IDs can we give? So first of all, the link between privacy and security, I was asked to provide that connection, and Lillie already mentioned it before regarding the Sony breach, the links between privacy and cybersecurity. Well, in the first step, so both are broader than the others. So privacy is just more than loss prevention and making sure that your data is not going to be stolen or lost, or the typical example of a laptop being left in a taxi. Staff awareness, etc. It's much more than that. But security is also much more than the protection of personal data. It's also companies' data, IP, etc. So They're closely linked, but broader than each other. They're also distinct, but go hand in hand, and I think that identity and access management is a good example. Because in fact security is about, do you have access to the data, or do others, authorized or not authorized parties, do they have access to the data, while privacy is in fact, should you have access to the data, so that I'll come back to data mapping in a moment, but so what we always propose when you do some data mapping is also to make it multidimensional or third dimension, that we say, not only where data flows, but also how are they used. Because that's the first step of what we call your privacy business case. If you're ever challenged by data protection authority, you need to explain if you were authorized or if it's a legitimate use of personal data. So there, that's the difference that privacy brings in. This is the classical, old school and unacceptable way of looking at the issue. So there was privacy, the typical classical law firm approach, where you draft beautiful policies, but then you come to your company and you give it to your IT people or your security people or your marketing and sales people, and they say, wonderful policy, but I cannot work with that, that's not workable in practice. Or that's nice, but the IT person will tell you then that's 100 FTEs, okay, when do we start and where do I get the budget from? The other side is security, the typical IT niche firms that say, well, we can build you the most beautiful castle, nobody will get in. But then you talk to the marketing and sales people and they will say, fine, but we want people to be able to come in, and also we want to be able to get some things moving and going out. So what you really should look at it is to integrate both and look at it both from a legal and a technological perspective. And so translate your perfect theory into practical ways of working of your company. And it's you, companies or organizations, it's you working or having a function within that organization that knows the company the best. So not external consultants, not lawyers, not IT firms. You need to understand the risks, and you need to know to understand the threats. And that's why in the proposed regulation, when you look at the requirements of a data protection officer, whether it will be mandatory or not, that's another question, but the requirements, I totally agree that should be somebody, one of the points is that knows the industry very well, because how can you say that you can protect your company as data protection officer when you cannot identify the threats if you don't know the industry you operate in? Then there's something called the privacy security paradox, which is both in the public and in the private sector. Nowadays, with everything that happened in Paris and also in Belgium, there were some arrests. Anyway, so there's more and more the voices to say, look, we need to have more control over personal data. Again, that data retention directive that you all know that has been cancelled. Well, there are voices now that say we should have something new to better control the threats of modern society. On the other hand, you also have a privacy security paradox within companies, and that's in fact what you need to do is to manage that paradox, because if you really want to protect privacy, you need to have security measures in place. But if you want to do that well, and you want to make sure that, for example, in the case of identity and access management, if you want to know that the person logging on a specific screen or in a specific system is the person you think it is, you need to also have a profile of that person. You need to somehow follow that person, link it to personal habits, and then again it goes against privacy. So you see the privacy and security sometimes go against each other, and what a DPO should be able to do is to combine both, and then again build your privacy business case. So when you're challenged by external parties, by data subjects, or by authorities, that you can say, look, this is how we think we protect the privacy of individuals the best. This picture, because I'm surrounded by health professionals, my wife, my parents, etc. So now that we have kids, we have two wonderful sons. I said, well, if something happens, I would want to know how you do the heart massage, etc. So I said, can you explain it to me? But I once heard a story about people who don't do it well, and they then break the ribs of the individual. So I said, well, if this happens, I mean, I have a lot of, sometimes I think I don't know that I have so much power, etc. So I say, what if I break a rib? And my wife and my parents were looking at me and they were saying, okay, but what's the option? What's the alternative? The person is dead, you know? I mean, otherwise he or she stays dead. So I think, in fact, that's the situation we're in when we talk about cybersecurity. There's no other option. I mean, there's no alternative than tackle the issue and protect yourself against cybersecurity threats. Not just the cybersecurity as putting in place some measures and buying some good software, but really going to cyber resilience and as Laurent mentioned, really the threat and the risk management approach. So the question is not so much will you be hacked, but when will you be hacked? I don't want to be too fatalistic here, but that's the situation we have to face nowadays. So 90% of the companies worldwide, they recognize that they're insufficiently prepared to protect themselves against these cyber threats. So what do you need to, does your organization have to do? They have to understand the key cyber risks, establish the value they want to protect, the risks they want to take, and knowing for how long they can ensure that protection, and so really understand the threat environment. So this 90% is not just such a number. I will give you also some information and tools you can follow up with. There's a study that's now being presented at the World Economic Forum in Davos, which is called Partnering for Cyber Resilience Towards the Quantification of Cyber Threats. So if you Google that, you can download it for free, and that's very interesting. It's an input 50 organizations worldwide. And that study helps to better understand which risk decisions you could take from a cyber security point of view, how to develop these strategies, and I mean how in the common market you live in, you can address the questions like the vulnerability you have, the who might be that's the typo there, who might be targeting us, and how valuable are the key assets at stake. Another interesting study which you can also download for free on the internet is the same of the World Economic Forum of some years ago, which talks about the Partnership for Cyber Resilience, the Partnership for Cyber Resilience Initiative, which was set up, I think, in 2011 to raise some awareness on cybersecurity risk. And just the study will give you some guidelines, some ideas. So if within your organization you need to defend this, you need to defend it to a board or to key decision makers, please take a look at that. It has some recommendations for the public sector, the private, both public and private sector, but also for people from the academic world. So that's really worth looking at. We have mentioned before, Laurent has mentioned before, the main drivers for privacy and cybersecurity. So I don't want to stay too long with this slide, but it's from different aspects you can see. So both the organization, the brand value has been mentioned before. So it's true that the press coverage of all the breaches raises the awareness also amongst companies, and the leaders and the decision makers. They want to be able to sleep at night, so they know which threats there are. So the brand protection is one of the key drivers there, but also the inconsistencies between policies and cyber security practices. So even in the future, the data protection authorities will be more active, and if really there will be fines of more than 5% of worldwide turnover. Imagine you have an inspection of data protection authority. So if you are the DPO, what will they do? They will come into your office, but before going to your office, they will first talk to some people and say, who's your DPO? What is your privacy policy about taking your devices home? Can you send your some files to your Hotmail or Gmail address or whatever? And then depending on that answer, so they listen to the people, and then they go to your office, and then if as a DPO you say, look, I have very well understood the principle of accountability. I need to be able to present a pile of information to you when you step in. Well, you're here, here's the pile of information. They'll say, okay, that's fine, but it doesn't really match with what happens in the company. So that's the famous paper tiger that we always say to clients we advise. That's something you really need to avoid. So you need to be able to link what happens in your company, what's on paper, to the real practices. The digital revolution is another thing, and also the globalization, the outsourcing. So there are many things out there. Nowadays you can put everything you want in the cloud. All services are available on all different devices. But this brings some threats with it. Also, if people can take devices home, are they aware of the security issues that it brings? Customer focused is another thing. I mentioned marketing before, so people want to be treated in a personalized way, but on the other hand, people hate it when they receive emails which are way too personalized, or when they go on Google and they looked for travel to the US 3 weeks ago, and then 3 weeks later they still see publicity for that. So it's like a creepy feeling of, what do you know about me, right? But that's a challenge as a company or as an organization you need to be able to manage. The regulatory landscape, I think it's quite obvious in the cybersecurity and privacy world that's a big driver for privacy and cybersecurity, and then the growing awareness as a whole, together with the press, that helps a lot. So we need new tools, and we need new technologies because the threats are evolving. So just to give you an idea, the threat landscape, how could you divide it? I mean, a way of dividing the threat landscape, and that's just an example here, but please map it to your organization the way it works the best. But you can divide it into current threats, the emerging threats, and the future threats. And also the level of concerns to your company. You see the green would be the low, and then the middle, and then the high concern. But also whether it's a known threat or whether it's possible in the future, etc. So if you divide it that way, and if you understand the threat landscape, that's really the first step. Understand that not only the threats, but also your own organization. And when I talked about data mapping before, that's the best way to talk with other departments about your company when we talk about data. So you see it in the, you have little, what happens in companies nowadays, they have processes. Problem is, companies and organizations are organized in silos. So a process would be how data, our decisions are taken, or how data flow within one single silo. But we all know that data, in fact, they flow horizontally between these different silos. So you need to be able to map that in a way that you need to do that to understand the risk. So in the left-hand side, you would have the data collection. Then where are they stored? What is that it's shared, with whom is it shared, and how is it destroyed? It's something that people often forget. Companies, organizations often keep data just forever, you never know. Well, that's not really a good way of, if a data protection authority would challenge you on that, or data subject, you need to have an answer. So there you need to build in that third, third pillar of the use of the data, and if it's a legitimate use of the data, so you build it into that data mapping. But then also not only knowing your own company, but knowing your enemy, make a distinction of the maturity of the attacker and his sophistication. And for example, Laurent mentioned before the script kiddie, which is somewhere in the middle, but you also have very sophisticated hackers out there. So make a decision what the risk-based approach is from your company, what the risk appetite is, and if it's really the return on investment of investing in cybersecurity protection and measures to because the highest cost might not really stop them all. I mean, so it's there you have to make a risk-based decision on it. So the cohesive approach, some guiding principles there. So first of all, understand the risk appetite of your organization. Ensure close alignment with business or organizational goals, because otherwise you cannot operate in a vacuum, in something empty, because otherwise it won't last very long. Then prepare for the worst, but as I said, make that a risk-based decision. Share the intelligence within your organization, and then instill a broad awareness on cybersecurity within your company. So I won't go too much into detail on these slides, but just to give you an idea, there was the colleagues of Deloitte have provided me some ideas, so you can have an idea of how this visually would look like to divide the risk into an easy to understand chart that you can put on the table and discuss with your colleagues. So you have different maturity levels within the entire world, organizational world, business world. So make sure you understand which risk level your colleagues or your competitors have, and making understand that it's not the same. Let's say a football team who has or a hairdresser who has personal data, or banks. You know, the risk appetite might be different, but also the way of looking at risk from another point of view. So not only the data protection point of view, but also like financial sectors, they need to protect also their financial assets. So a good example here is that the competency wheel that Deloitte has developed. I'm not here to sell it, but I just want to give you an idea of it works. So traditional point was that you had an IT person who was trying to defend the company. Then it moved to the governance. You really needed a governmental organization within your organization, so not just one person. But we have moved to the next step also, which is you need to be cyber resilient, and you need to have new cyber capabilities to really understand the threats and tackle them. So into another a way of looking at it, you see there you have the cyber threat model, and you just put there all the risks you have, the threats you see, and you color code them, because that's the way a lot of companies or a lot of stakeholders within your company think, risks, color coding, and how should we really divide and make these decisions. Yesterday I listened to some DPAs, and they also said sometimes we need to make some decisions when there's a complaint. We'll hear the same. Your stakeholders will will have to take decisions on which issue to tackle first. The second, in the middle, you see the business services, so really understand your company, and that's an advantage you have towards data protection authorities who want to perhaps give you a fine in the future. You better understand your organization more than anybody else. So divide the threats and link them to how your business is organized, or your organization. You see there BU, business unit 1, 2, and 3, and 4, whatever. So make an overview of that together with the data mapping and link them together, and then in every conversation you will have with your stakeholders, it will be very easy to convince them how it really works in your company. And then the third part is indeed that cyber security capabilities wheel, where you look at all the threats and how you have covered them. So in summary, and to give the conclusion of this, so you need to treat privacy and cyber security together, not in an isolated approach. As I said, it's old school, but really unacceptable nowadays. The regulation talks about the same as a directive, you need to have the measures, organizational and technical measures in place. Well, that separated approach, that's not what they expect nowadays. So there's a very active hacking community out there, so there will always be a breach in the future. No, I don't want to make you too scared, but at least make sure that you're prepared. There's that upcoming reform, which is a good help to that 5% really helps to get privacy and cybersecurity on the board's agenda. I can assure you that. Press coverage was mentioned before, Sony, Target, etc. International scandals, also now what I showed about Merkel. So what happens nowadays that governments want to have more data about individuals against terrorist attacks and threats, and then also the impact of big data initiatives. I wanted to put the buzzword somewhere in the slides. I put it at the end because we could do an whole seminar about big data if you want. But that's something that people within an organization that can go from the hairdresser I mentioned, but also to the big department stores, etc. They want to collect all the information they store and have something useful out of it. So a lot of challenges with that, also a lot of challenges because data will be everywhere. So that's make sure that you don't forget the privacy part there. So you can do everything but think about the individuals and the rights of the data subject. And avoid the misconceptions that security is only technology and privacy is only policy. And that's me.
Thank you, Maarten. Douwe, would you like to change the perspective a little?
Okay, thank you. Now I'm hoping somebody else can put my slides up. Yeah, hurrah, thank you, Matt. Because I haven't plugged them in here. As you can see from this, I am working with the, with the Cybersecurity Center of the University of Oxford, which is part of the Oxford Martin School of the University of Oxford. And I'm also a fellow of the Center for Internet and Human Rights. And maybe Ben Wagner is even in the room. Are you there yet, Ben, or not? No. This is one problem of sitting here. We're sitting a bit on a stage. We can't see you at all. So it makes interaction slightly difficult. Hopefully, we can still have a good discussion later on. As you can see, I'm talking about cybersecurity and human rights, so I have a rather different angle from the other speakers. I hope that that is a positive thing. I'm also focusing more on cybersecurity as a state issue and an international intercooperation issue rather than intercompany issues. And maybe we can go to the next slide. How do I do this? I just go, oh, you do it for me. Thank you. Great. And the first thing that, if you look at it in that broader perspective that you come up with is that the word cybersecurity, and I agree there with my friend from Paris, is not an easy term, and it's not a very nice term. It's massively broad. I didn't want to spell it out in slides, so I brought along a handout if you want it. That handout shows a number of definitions, or at least working models on what is and what is not covered by cybersecurity, and it's absolutely massive. It includes technical threats to IT infrastructure. It includes cybercrime in the sense in which that is used, say, in the Cybercrime Convention, the Budapest Convention, and that covers an enormous range of activities, anything from malicious attacks on infrastructure to hate crime, hate speech, which is controversial, which is why it's an optional protocol, copyright infringements. So there's a massive amount of criminal activity that is covered by this rather weird term, cyber crime. And then in cybersecurity, people who are looking at it, they're looking at the activity of law enforcement agencies, but also, and this is a problem I'll come back to, increasingly to the activities of military and national security agencies. So it's a very broad field even in that respect. Some people even add civil law, like e-contracts and the like, although I would say generally when you talk about security, it's better to look at the criminal side. And then if you look at all those issues, from a lawyer's point of view, I then see, well, you're talking about substantive law. What constitutes the crime? What are the elements of the crime? What are the exceptions to the crime? And copyright, that's a particularly intriguing one. You're talking at procedure, and then I really get to the core of what I want to talk about. Who investigates? How do they investigate? Where do they investigate? And how do they exchange data? All of that is supposed to be covered by this, this term cybersecurity, and then increasingly it's not just at the national level, they might have a cybersecurity policy, but also internationally, where there are increasing attempts to try and get to international cooperation to deal with cybersecurity. Now, I hope that the one and only thing I've made clear in this particular slide is this is an enormously big collection of very different things. So let's look at it from a human rights perspective in the next slide. Thanks. There are essentially a great many activities that are covered by the term cybersecurity, or activities related to cybersecurity are human rights sensitive. And I don't think people always realize that. An awful lot of people think security is a pretty technical thing. All we need to do is protect the infrastructure. And all we're trying to do is be good. But it tends to involve monitoring of what's happening on the infrastructure. What's happening on the internet, what's happening on your computer, what's happening on your server. That is inherently intrusive. The next thing is it tends to increasingly mean that you're pulling data, including personal data. And then the next thing is that you're going to look at those data, you're going to analyze them, and you might come up with profiles of possible attackers. The moment this involves personal data, and when you're talking about cybersecurity and attackers, you're almost always talking about personal data, this inherently involves an interference with the private life and privacy of the people that you're monitoring. You cannot escape that. So you're immediately in human rights sensitive areas. And once you monitor people, it's not only their privacy, it also might affect their freedom of expression. If you're looking for hate speech writers, for instance, or blasphemers. And it can involve their right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, even freedom of religion. Furthermore, if you're looking at this in a criminal investigation context, it will automatically or very quickly involve fair trial and fair investigation questions. Has the evidence been properly secured? How reliable is it? Has it been fairly obtained? Is it usable in evidence? There's a massive issues. I'll go to the next slide, if we may. I come up with three complicating factors that make the human rights issues in this context particularly difficult to deal with. The first one is that very often you will have cooperation and data exchanges between the state and private entities. Of course, especially internet service providers. We all know about compulsory data retention and most of the data that's being sought to try and tackle cybersecurity issues tends to be in the hands of private entities rather than public ones. The second one is if you have cooperation between law enforcement agencies and national security agencies. And I think this is probably one of the biggest issues. And I've noticed that there are 2 or 3 other sessions later today when these matters will be discussed, but I really think that needs to be flagged up already in this session. There's an increasing trend to conflate cybersecurity with national security. The kind of speeches that are being made by people like Obama and Cameron and Hollande and Merkel increasingly suggest that cybersecurity issues are national security issues, and that the national security agencies are the right agencies to deal with these issues, at least at an international and higher national level. That is extremely worrying, and I'll come to it, but it very often involves nowadays the exchanges of data between law enforcement agencies and national security agencies. And then the further complicating factor, which is if there is anything transnational going on, and I've already hinted that there is. So you may have data exchanges between law enforcement agencies in one country and a private sector body, an ISP or a telecommunications firm or a social network in another country. You may have data exchanges between different law enforcement agencies in different countries, and you may have exchanges between national security agencies in different countries. I am extremely worried when I read just yesterday or the day before yesterday that the leaders in Western Europe are saying there should be more cooperation between national security agencies in Europe and those in neighboring countries, by which they seem to mean North Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia. Those are not very nice countries. A great many of them use torture, disappearances, suppression of dissidents. So if you're talking about cooperation in the fight against cyber crime and cyber security between our national security agencies and national security agencies of, say, Egypt or Syria or Iraq, then I'm getting very frightened by this. Just this morning, I haven't had the time to read The Guardian, but the front page I saw when I downloaded it says it's just been exposed that there were something like 1,600 questions put forward by the British authorities to Gaddafi's interrogators to put to people that they had in their detention. International cooperation in the field of cybercrime and cybersecurity should never stray into areas like that in those kind of ways. We're talking about extremely sensitive issues here, and the one fear I have when people talk about cybersecurity is they think, oh, it's all boring, it's all technical stuff, and it's just people making sure that the firewalls work. Whereas, as you can see from what I said at the beginning, the definitions of the scope of what is covered by cybersecurity is massive and covers all sorts of issues that are extremely sensitive. I'll go to the next slide, and I'm just told to keep it a little bit short, which is very easy, because all I have to do is refer to an issue paper which I wrote for the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe. It's called The Rule of Law on the Internet in the Wider Digital World. It's very easy to find. You don't need the long URL. If you type in COE, that's short for the Council of Europe, Commissioner for Human Rights issue paper, you automatically get to the page, and this is the latest one that's come out. It covers a host of these issues and more, including the matters that are going to be discussed at these later panels, like jurisdiction. Very difficult issue in relation to the internet. My thesis, the thesis that's been adopted also by the Commissioner, by Niels Muschnick, is that if a state pulls data from a server in another state, it's violating the sovereignty of that other state if it does so without the consent of that other country. The Cybercrime Convention is particularly problematic in that regard, in particular Article 32, which seems to suggest that law enforcement agencies can pull data from servers in other countries. And again, I've demonstrated that that was not the intention that it was written. It is highly problematic. It bypasses the proper procedure for international cooperation in law enforcement, which is to use MLATs, mutual legal assistance treaties, those are increasingly bypassed, with states pulling data from other states. And invariably, Western politicians say, what's wrong with us getting data from a server that happens to be somewhere else? They never realize that they wouldn't be so happy if Iran or China were pulling data from the servers in their own country. And that is the way you must think about this in the broader international context. When it comes to the national security agencies, almost the only thing you can say is that for much too long, they have been operating in a legal vacuum, outside the rule of law. And that is utterly and totally unacceptable. In Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights applies to all activities of the state, including national security agencies. It has barely been done in practice. The few cases in Strasbourg are very limited because the spooks have been operating in the darkness and in the shadows. States have been trying for years and years to keep the operations of the national security agencies utterly outside the rule of law, and that is unacceptable. It will have to be ended. We cannot have international cooperation against cybercrime or on cybersecurity without setting up a proper legal framework that covers all the agencies that are involved in it. That brings me back to what I said earlier. You cannot say, let's come up with a bigger role for the national security agencies in the context of cybersecurity, and at the same time leave them outside of the rule of law. We need treaties to cover their activities. We need national laws that cover their activities. The one thing I can say here, my friend and colleague Ian Brown has pointed this out very recently in a good paper, the laws on the national security agencies and their activities, especially with relation to foreign communications, are as bad in Europe as they are in America. In America, you're beginning to do something about it. Not enough, but you're beginning to do something about it. In Europe, we haven't properly started the debate. The German law, for instance, allows access to foreign communications on a much wider scale than is compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. We must bring that debate in. One problem there is that the European Union, which tends to be the lead in many of these issues, has no competences, supposedly has no competences with regard to the activities of member states relating to national security. The United Kingdom is consistently using that clause, it's Article 6 or 7 of the treaty, of the main treaty on the EU, to even stop debate on national security issues, for instance, in the Libe Committee of the European Parliament. That too is unacceptable. And what happens at the same time, just a few days ago, there was a decision by the Council on more cooperation in the fight against terrorism. That is, and they do that sort of half in and half outside of EU competences. I had an exchange, some emails on how the hell they could do it. If they have no competence, how can they do it within an EU forum? And apparently the EU allows the foreign ministers and the ministers of home affairs to discuss these things within an EU forum, but outside the EU legal framework. That again is unacceptable. I think the exception for national security will have to be abandoned. If you want EU policy on cybersecurity and on the fight against terrorism and on all these issues that are in the Cybercrime Convention, then you cannot maintain the exemption for national security in the way in which it is being operated now. So I hope I have indicated, and maybe now my last, if you want cybersecurity, then you'll have to talk about how can we do that in a human rights compatible way, rather than how can we let our spooks do whatever we feel like letting them do and work our way around human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you, Douwe, for that passionate, different way of looking at things that I don't know about anybody else, but I certainly haven't looked at it that way. So let me first say, if we have questions in the audience, I'm sure we have plenty up here we can go with. Would you like to you want to start there, and then we'll work our way down? She's bringing a microphone.
It's a pity that we can't have light on you, because we can barely see you. It's one thing
right there.
Plaid
shirt.
I'd like to see you first.
Yes. Why don't we just get on with it? Here you go. A couple of elephants in One is that we are told that sectoral communication between, companies in the same kind of sector, financial, banking, insurance, etc., may be helpful in terms of preparedness, alerting, within the bounds of business privacy, business confidentiality. Okay? And this I would like you to comment on, because there are tensions between pressures on competitiveness and on market share for divulging any vulnerability to the wider public. That's one of the factors. The other factor is you could think about organizational privacy. Perhaps it should be the case that an organization could privately discuss together, the degree of their vulnerability and the impacts of any incidents on them without having to go megaphonic on it on the world stage, which might actually kind of harm their collective interests as well as individual interests. So that today it may be one of the members of a sector, tomorrow will be another. So they have a joint and collective interest in maintaining some degree of privacy, also to the extent that this helps the attackers not know just how much damage they have inflicted. That is also useful. At the moment, this happens in a sort of haphazard way or unpredictable way. Some companies might leak, or some information might leak about the vulnerability, about an incident. In other cases, it goes unnoticed and no one would ever know. This defies the principle of collective learning, harvesting collective insight about how to tackle these things, since we are not actually individually being threatened, but collectively being threatened. That's one of the questions. I have two other questions. The gentleman from OECD said that actually impact assessment, privacy impact assessment differs from security threat assessment insofar as when you're doing privacy impact assessment, you're actually assessing the impact on others. This is not true. Number two, perhaps even number one, victim of a lapse in privacy is the organization under whose kind of operational framework a privacy lapse has occurred, because organizations are responsible for maintaining privacy and data protection. So when you're doing privacy impact assessment, you're not just looking at what will happen to Joe Public, but you have to look at your own liabilities in terms of complying with that. And number three is regarding the dilemma of how actually you would have to navigate a space between situations where there's prima facie evidence of someone being culpable. And in normal law, I would imagine they would forfeit some of the rights of privacy if somebody is seen to be culpable in terms of having attacked some place. Then information about the manner in which they attacked, their identity, the DNS, from where it comes, is reasonably expected to be analyzed and looked at. This would be the case if somebody was seen to have been, involved in some burglary. There was evidence, some evidence, and that under those circumstances, the total resort to all the human rights and everything that there is to protect a person who is innocent would not necessarily apply. So I would think there's common sense for people to engage, to communicate information about the nature of attacks they are expecting. And so governments need to communicate with each other. Otherwise, we just lie flat and let it all happen to us. So, I couldn't quite get my head around a sort of categoric ban on anything to do with exchange of any information without any clause in it, because that clause exists in legal frameworks. Thank you.
So would you like to speak first in response?
I'll try. It's a big, it's a number of questions, and we don't have a lot of time, so I just cannot address everything you've said. Just, I take 2 points. The first one is sharing information within a sector in relation to threats or vulnerabilities, incidents, raising challenges. Yes, it does raise challenges. It is particularly complex, in particular for the reason you've mentioned. There are tensions in relation to competition. Private sector is not always welcoming sharing information with governments, given that they don't really know what the government is going to do with that information. They can use it for protecting networks, which is in the interest of all economic actors. They can also use it, as we know, for abusing networks. So sharing information with them requires a framework, requires trust, requires a number of requirements. Sharing, the same is true with sharing with competitors, and this is a complex issue. We see policy initiatives in some countries to try to foster it. Governments saying, okay, we have to find the right drivers for this to happen, because it will be useful. As you've said, collective intelligence is useful in that case. But which incentive and how to create that situation is not yet very clear. Some countries are more advanced than others. There are a lot of initiatives in the UK and in the US on this, but it's not the case everywhere. What I, as a personal point, I would say what I see when I speak to security people operating in business is that there is exchange of information, but it's personal and it's based on trust, personal trust, not business, not legal requirements. They talk to each other, but perhaps that's not enough. So we have to go to the next stage. On the privacy impact assessment versus threat assessment, I think here we face the difficulty for me to explain concepts in a very short time, concepts that are not that easy, that are actually complex. A privacy impact assessment can be seen as equivalent to a risk assessment on the security side. It's kind of the same spirit, but that is not the same as risk management. Risk management is a decision-making process. It's not just an assessment. And when we try to compare a privacy approach based on privacy impact assessment, which is, again, very useful, and the whole framework for security risk management, there are differences. It's not the same. And I'm not sure I was clear, but when I said the person facing the consequences of a privacy breach, I'm talking about the data subject.
That's what I'm also talking about, but also one of the other subjects, which is very important, is the organization who has the liability. So you said that it didn't really matter because you were going to just be concentrating on a citizen. It's not.
Yes, but the negative impact on the organization is the legal consequences, not the actual breach, the legal consequences of not having addressed the breach. It's not the same thing. But again, I think there is work to do in that space to actually discuss exactly what we're discussing now, and that's what we're trying to do in the course of next year.
Maarten, do you have some other thoughts you'd like to add?
Yes, indeed. So it's quite tempting to exchange a lot of information. I think here the only thing I want to add to that is that the privacy principles should always be taken into account. So proportionality for sure, and then the goal you have to exchange the information. You can, for example, if you talk about exchanging information of threats, you could say IP addresses of computers that are hacked and that the threat can come from that. That's one thing. On the other hand, more personal information, I don't think it would be adequate to interchange that. So. To come back to your question, in isolation, no, you cannot work as one organization in isolation, but I think you cannot also work on these kind of projects in isolation from data protection authorities. You need to make sure that they also feel comfortable with the individuals they want to protect. So I think the general conclusion of this could be that, first of all, you need to have a plan to cut the big cyber monster into different pieces as an organization. Have a tailored plan, not just a plan, but a tailored plan. And you all know the expression, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, if I want to be quoted on something, I would say there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all for privacy and security, because that's at the same time also the best weapon you have to defend yourself against challenges from data protection authorities and other stakeholders.
Lillie, do you have anything you wanted to add? And I do want to make sure we have enough time so that Douwe can speak at the end.
Only that it's important to understand that privacy is not a defense against committing crimes, etc. But there is a requirement for due process for determining whether someone is or is not guilty of committing a crime, and also in an international context, what's the definition of a crime? So all of that has to be brought into play, and also moving beyond entities looking at their security as only being their own problem, but looking at developing community, extending that to nation states, working collaboratively, but keeping in mind that the values and the considerations for human rights or civil rights or legal rights are going to be different. So defining what is and what is not a basis for sharing data or engaging in certain types of transborder activities need to be defined clearly.
I'll be very quick because I think we all need a cup of coffee. The main points, Lillie just made it as well. Just because you're looking for bad people doesn't mean that human rights goes out of the window. It's quite the opposite. Human rights are there specifically for people who are accused of being bad people. So if you're looking for an attacker in your network and you think you have identified him, that's when human rights kicks in. The moment somebody becomes a suspect or accused of a criminal act, that is when you'll have to start complying more specifically with important human rights principles. So how you gather evidence against that person becomes important. How you're going to use that evidence against them. Even before that, what profiles you're using to try and identify these people. And remember that we're talking about an enormous range of crimes. And again, Lillie said it, the crimes are not the same in all countries. So are you happy for the Iranians to be looking for people who say blasphemous things after Charlie Hebdo? I think we should watch out with the idea that, oh, we're on the good side, we're just looking for bad attackers. You should be very aware of the human rights sensitive nature of your activities. So, of course, we need data security, but we need it in a human rights compliant way. Thank you. I think we agree.
So I show that we're actually 5 minutes late. So I think what I'm going to do right now is thank the panelists for a very interesting discussion and different perspectives. And I'm sure that you guys will be around so that if there's more questions, because I think there were more hands up, you can come ask the panelists later on. Thank you.
Anybody wants to hand out?